Cool. Thanks very much. Really great to be here in Adelaide. Never been here before, so thanks, Dan, for laughing. So well, as you can see, the talk title is slightly different to what was in the program. That's mainly because I realised I was giving another talk on Thursday and I had to make them slightly different. So this is going to give a slightly broader overview of offsets within the policy process, and then on Thursday, you're welcome to come along to the Threatened Species Recovery Hub Roadshow, which is free to register. And I'll also note that the next presentation happily seems to be on expert elicitation as well, so I'm sure they will go over the process in a bit more detail than I will. So just obligatory slide explaining what biodiversity offsetting is. It's a technique used to compensate for irreversible or unavoidable impacts on biodiversity from development activities. And as the federal environmental offsets policy states, offsets must deliver a conservation outcome that improves or maintains the viability of protected matter. Protected matter meaning threatened species and ecological communities are listed under the EPBC Act. Now, offsets are not an isolated policy tool. They're embedded within environmental impact assessment processes, which, as most of you I'm sure are fully aware, are integrated at federal, state and often state levels as well. So this is a really highly complex regulatory environment, and I guess I'm just trying to emphasise that this is a policy instrument that sits within this complex web of actors, processes, so there's very much a human element to the interpretation and application of this policy. Some work that I did through my PhD research essentially went to the horse's mouth, so to speak, and I spoke to 30 different professionals working in environmental offsets policy, and mainly at the federal level, like focusing on the EPBC policy. Spoke to people from industry, consulting, government, the legal profession, to get an understanding of what are the issues that you find when dealing with this policy in practice. And I'll go through three main challenges because 3 is a good number. So the first main challenge is really just the process itself. It's really, really complex. So this essentially situates the process into 5 stages. There's the design, assessment and approval, where the regulator comes into play. There's an approval decision, whereby that's when a project gets signed off by the regulator. And then the actual offset needs to be done, implemented on the ground. Someone needs to check to see whether it's been done or not. And then hopefully at the end of it, we get some environmental outcomes from that process. Within that assessment approval process, there's a much more complex process. And I'm going to try to take you through this. This is just to kind of indicate where offsets sit within the EPBC decision process. So the first thing in the EPBC decision is the impact significant? Is it having a significant impact on the matter? If not, no, we don't need an EPBC approval. Offsets don't apply. If yes, proponent needs to apply to the department. Minister has 20 days to decide whether it's a controlled action, not a controlled action, particular matter, not controlled action, or clearly unacceptable. Only the controlled action component is where offsets apply. So you can see the further along you go the decision process, things kind of start to not be captured to an extent in terms of non-significant minor impacts that cumulatively lead to or contribute to biodiversity loss. There's an assessment that's generally done through environmental impact assessment, and then the department has to make a decision within 20 to 40 business days about what to do with that project. So that's really not a whole lot of time to bring science, economics, a whole range of factors into making this decision whether it should go ahead or not, considering there might be multiple threatened species, multiple layers of legislation. After that, there's a question, is offsetting proposed, appropriate and feasible? If yes, the offset policy applies. If no, then the project may or may not still be approved. So, and offsets may still apply after that. So we have a decision pathway where offsets might be not proposed, not appropriate, or not feasible, but an impact is still approved because together with economic and social factors, the action is deemed acceptable. So that's to kind of illustrate the complexity, and the policymakers I spoke to at the federal level suggested, well, they felt really kind of constrained by that process and suggested that it's difficult to actually refuse a project on the basis that you can't find an offset. And that's largely because the policy itself isn't a statutory document. It's not, linked explicitly to the legislation. And there was also a feeling that as they become more comfortable with offsets, then yes, decisions are increasingly being made whereby, if you impact it, you can offset it somehow. But in the end, it could be that there might not be anything suitable. And that's kind of this point here where you can still approve it even if the offset's not feasible. This decision point here shows that regardless of whether offsets are feasible or not, you still go to the same decision point whereby it's approved or not. So that's obviously complex. The second key challenge is long-term governance. So one of the key things with offsets at the federal level is that the federal government has, or at least takes, a limited role beyond the expiry of an offset management plan that's attached to the EPBC conditions of approval. So, and largely these conditions are very bespoke. So an approval condition might last between 2 and 100 years. Average is about 20 years. So after that point in time, the federal government has no role in checking compliance for that action. So it's essentially up to the proponent. Well, the proponent's no longer liable after that expiry either, but whoever the offset is given to, and that's often not clear, they're the person responsible for long-term management and governance, and a lot of the time that's not really clear. So there's a bit of a hole in terms of the roles and responsibilities for offsets after that initial management plan. The third thing I'll mention are conditions of approval themselves. So these are legal documents which state what the proponent needs to do to fulfil its approval condition. And a lot of the time these conditions will specify inputs. So, you need to put up some nest boxes, or a condition could be quite vague and then it says you need to develop an offset management plan. Now that says nothing about what is the actual environmental outcome that needs to be delivered in compensation for an impact. So in terms of the legal wording of those conditions, if they're vague like that, then there's no real legal hook to ensure compliance with the proponent. And that was exemplified in some work that we did with David Lindemeyer's group, where they looked at some offsets that were put up to compensate for hollow-bearing trees along the Hume Highway expansion, and that was a New South Wales approval. Well, it was a huge project, but we were just looking at one component of the offset package. And the condition, well, one of the conditions for that was to compensate for the removal of hollow-bearing trees. And the condition said you will erect nest boxes, one nest box for each tree. So the proponent put up, I think it was 157 nest boxes. And they contracted David Lindemeyer's group to monitor these boxes to see, are the threatened species that we're meant to be compensating for, did they actually live in these nest boxes? And essentially they found, well, no, it was mostly rats and bees and stuff, and a lot of the boxes were falling down. That being said, the proponent is still legally compliant because they erected the nest boxes. So those kinds of, I guess, legalese, kind of boring details are actually really important in terms of delivering that overall outcome. So I mentioned 3 challenges. Given that I've only got a couple of minutes left, I'm going to mention some of the work that we're doing under the Threatened Species Recovery Cub, which is aiming to improve those conditions of approval, provide some more information that can help craft those conditions so they do deliver an environmental outcome. And recognising that policymakers and decision makers are operating under really constrained timeframes, they don't easily have access to information a lot of the time. So this is what we're trying to do to help that. It's particularly the case for critters that don't necessarily respond to protecting parcels of land. So for Tassie devils, their main threat is disease. Protecting habitat isn't necessarily going to improve their chances of survival. Similarly with the northern quoll, they live in the Pilbara region, which tenure restrictions, you can't exactly just buy a piece of land. So we're going to be we have used expert elicitation methods to get some of these numbers, and we're using the IDEA protocol, which has been developed over a long time. And I'll defer to the next speaker to talk about that stuff in more detail. We've run a case study, or we've run our first elicitation where we looked at malleefowl offsets, and we ran a survey whereby each expert submitted their estimate of the benefit of doing a particular management action for malleefowl. Within that, or between that process, there's discussion between the experts, and then afterwards they submit a revised estimate. And based on those individual estimates, we bring those together and get a group average result. So this is an example of a question. We say, look, consider a site where there's currently 5 active malleefowl mounds, so that's the measure of benefit or malleefowl happiness in that situation. Assuming that site is placed under protection, how many active mounds do you think there'll be in 20 years? So these are some of our results. The first dot is the baseline scenario. What if we did nothing to that site? And it shows that in 20 years, on average, there'll be 2.5 active mounds with some bounds of uncertainty, compared to 5 now in 2018. If we just protect the habitat, it doesn't really do much more it's not much better than doing nothing. And then you can see there's some other strategies. Is that 2 minutes? Oh, cool. Okay, I've got more time than I thought. So we've considered captive breeding, fox control, goat control, herbivore control, fire management. And a lot of these actions are really uncertain in terms of the benefits that they might deliver. So as you can see, in this situation, the best strategy is to do everything. But there's huge bounds of uncertainty, and that reflects not just the geographic variation in how malleefowl responds to different actions, but also just our legitimate uncertainty about how effective these actions are for malleefowl. And this links in with some of the work that Darren Southwell is doing under the Hub, which is actually doing ground-based empirical studies to look at these in more detail. We also considered a scenario where we said, okay, there's a piece of degraded cropping land, there's currently 5 active mounds, how many will there be in 20 years? And essentially, it didn't really matter what you did, it wasn't an awful lot better than doing nothing. And our participants essentially said that 20 years isn't enough time to deliver that benefit, so we need to consider that when making offset decisions. So to finish, offsets are hard, ecology is just part of it. One of my interviewees said that offsets are 10% ecology and 90% everything else. So we need to think about the legal and financial governance process side of things as well. And we can use these expert elicitation methods to support offset decisions. Thank you.